We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest.
Oh, how can you rest?
We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers, sons is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers, sons. Sing with us. We who believe in freedom cannot rest.
Oh, how can you rest?
We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The older I get, the better I know that the secret to my going on is with a razor in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. Not needing to clutch for power, not needing for the light just to shine on me. I need to be one in the number as we stand against tyranny. But now we who believe in freedom cannot rest.
Don't you
We
rest.
who believe in freedom cannot rest until it rest. You know that struggling myself don't mean a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way my struggle survives. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult, but I'm bound to no man's word. And know that we who believe in freedom cannot rest.
Oh, don't you
We
rest.
who believe in freedom cannot rest until one more time now. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. I believe, I believe, I believe, I believe. Do you believe? Do you believe? Do you believe in freedom? Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Allie D. Arman. I am the Executive Administrator for the Women's Foundation California. I use she or they pronouns. I will be serving as your Zoom administrator, host for this evening. So please feel free to contact me in the chat if you have any questions or experiencing any technical issues. First off, I'd like to say that I am calling in from the San Francisco Bay Area, the unceded lands of the Ohlone people, specifically on Muwekma Ohlone land in Oakland, California. And Miss Sophia Bracy Harris and her colleagues would like to acknowledge their location in Montgomery, Alabama, on the ancestral lands of the Muskogee Creek tribe. I invite you all to introduce yourself in the chat and list where you are calling from. Welcome you to use the native lands map that I've linked and pasted in the chat to give a land acknowledgement as well if you care to. But we'd love to hear who's here. Type in who you are and where you're calling from. And I'm going to pass to my co-coordinator, Mary Lassen, who's going to open things up for us. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Allie. I'm a longtime friend and colleague of Sophia's, and on behalf of the host committee, which has worked so hard to organize tonight's event, I want to welcome all of you who joined us. I know more people are in the process of joining, but we've had a great response. I also want to thank the Women's Foundation California for their terrific support of tonight's event. We will next hear from Bryan Stevenson, another longtime friend of Sophia's. will speak about Sophia and the importance of her book. As many of you know, Bryan is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, a human rights organization that's based in Montgomery, Alabama. Under his leadership, EJI has won major legal challenges, eliminating excessive and unfair sentencing, exonerating innocent death row prisoners, confronting abuse of the incarcerated and the mentally ill, and aiding children who have been prosecuted as adults. Mr. Stevenson has also initiated major new anti-poverty and anti-discrimination efforts that challenge inequality in our country. He led the creation of two highly acclaimed cultural sites in Montgomery, which opened in 2018, Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. These new national landmark institutions chronicle the legacy of slavery, lynching, and racial segregation, and the connection to mass incarceration and the contemporary issues of racial bias. I do want to mention that as we go to this segment, the recording that he made, you may need to adjust up your volume just a bit. So please, as we go to this, I know you're going to be very interested in hearing Bryan's thought. So Allie will get us there.
I'm so disappointed that I cannot be with you, but I'm still honored to have this opportunity to talk about my friend, Sophia Bracy Harris, and her extraordinary new book. Finding My Own Way is an important story for our times and for anyone who wants to understand the power and the challenge of advancing social justice in our nation. Like Sophia Bracy Harris, I grew up at a time when Jim Crow and segregation constrained the opportunities that many Black people in this country had. And I don't think we've talked enough about the consequences, the challenges, the trauma that Jim Crow created. Sophia grew up in a space where it wasn't subtle, it wasn't something you had to debate, it was explicit. Whites only, no coloreds. That iconography created a world that basically was designed to tell many Black children that they are less valuable, less worthy, less capable. And so overcoming that is no small thing. And I don't think we've really talked enough about the impact of decades of racial hierarchy and racial injustice. And that's why I think this book is so important. I started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools for Black kids when my dad was a teenager. And even though he was smart and hardworking, he didn't have the opportunities that he would have had there been high schools in our community. My brother was a year older than me. He was actually the first to go to the school when integration came, before the other Black kids came. And I remember that my mother would take me to the schoolyard during recess, and she would tell me to get on top of the car, climb over the fence, and meet my brother at recess, where he would run because he would be attacked by the other white kids. We didn't think of it as violence and fighting. We thought of it a little bit like fun. But even when we were 4 and 5 years old, this kind of racialized isolation was part of our experience. Sophia Bracy Harris was another first wave student, a person who went into spaces that had been closed to Black people. And when she and her sister showed up, there was animosity, there was tension, there was conflict, and yet she persisted. I think it's important that we know the challenges that Black families endured. It's important that we read in Sophia's book the trauma of having your home bombed, the trauma of being isolated, the trauma of being attacked, and still finding a way to overcome, to see education. I think when I think about Sophia's work and her story, what's amazing to me is that she had the judgment, she had the wisdom to not get pulled into the kind of conflict where you only want revenge. She wanted justice. And justice is different than revenge. It's something that goes beyond responsiveness to all of the oppression that you've experienced. And that's the power of this story. A woman who found a way to pursue equality, to achieve, to do well, and to then want to help others. And the beautiful project that was created here in Alabama to provide child care services is in many ways a manifestation of this larger struggle, this larger commitment to equality. I'm thrilled that she has taken the time to document this story, because coming up in Wetumpka, Alabama, when she grew up, is in and of itself an accomplishment. To hold on to your dignity, to hold on to your humanity, to hold on to the insights that allow you to become the great person that she became. When she won a MacArthur, it not only empowered individuals who knew her, but it empowered the entire state, a whole network of mothers and families that were just trying to survive, just trying to overcome. I'm thrilled that stories like this have become part of the public narrative, part of the public discourse. Because I'll be honest, I'm worried about the future of advocacy. I'm worried about the future of struggle. There are a lot of people who insist that the conditions be perfect, that the circumstances be guaranteed before they engage in the kind of activism that is necessary to yield change. And I worry about that because the conditions will never be perfect. The circumstances will never be ideal. Outcomes will never be guaranteed. Sophia Bracy Harris represents a generation of people, a generation of women in particular, who learned to stand up even when people said sit down. She learned to speak even when people said be quiet. When people said it can't be done, she decided that it has to be done. When people said there's no way this can be achieved, she said there's always going to be a way. That's why I have to find my own way. And that narrative, that story, that declaration, this book is an important documentation of what that requires. And that's why I'm eager and excited to encourage everyone to not only read it, but to embrace all that is contained within this story and the truth that it holds. Again, I wish I could be there with you, but I want to just celebrate all of you for taking time to learn more, to do more, and to be more like the kind of courageous soldier, the kind of courageous warrior for justice, the kind of courageous human being that is represented in the life of Sophia Bracy Harris. My best wishes to all of you, and look forward to hearing more about your journey as you find your way in the footsteps of one of our great civil rights leaders, Sophia Bracy Harris. Thank you all.
Bryan Stevenson spoke volumes in his very thoughtful introduction, which now sets the stage for the discussion that Surina Khan will be leading with Sophia. Surina leads the Women's Foundation California's work to advance gender, racial, and economic justice. The foundation's strategy is based on building community-based power, training community leaders in policy advocacy, investing in grassroots nonprofit organizations, and connecting key partners and mobilizing significant financial resources. Surina's enthusiastic embrace of this event will be evident as she and Sophia discuss the book and Sophia's trajectory. Then she'll open things up for questions and answers with all of you. Please add your questions to the chat as we proceed. We already have a number that people submitted in advance, but we welcome more. So over to you, Sophia and Surina.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I want to thank Mary, and I think we should all be thanking Mary because she really spearheaded the organizing for this event and motivated all of us on the host committee to get all of you here. We had more than 200 people register, and we'll, as you know, we're recording this event, so we'll make it available to those who weren't able to join us at the last minute. So I'm just delighted to be in conversation with Sophia. There you are. And I got to know Sophia several years ago when she and Marty MacArthur, who's also here with us tonight, facilitated a retreat that I was invited to at the Orchard House, which is by invitation of Kit Miller, who's also on the host committee and here tonight. So to start our conversation, I just wanted to first say what a powerful message that was from Bryan Stevenson. He's one of the people who gave advance praise for your book, along with Dorian Warren, who's president of Community Change, Rebecca Adamson, an Indigenous economist, Gloria Steinem, among many others, including Kit Miller, who, as I mentioned, is on our host committee and is here with us tonight. And I thought it fitting to start with what she had to say for advance praise for the book. And Kit says, Sophia Bracy Harris's coming-of-age story is the perfect book for this explosive moment in America and the world. This organizer, mother, and visionary shares her deep understanding of racism, honed from her Alabama childhood, integration of Wetumpka High, the firebombing of her family home, and her lifetime of advocacy for Black children. Sophia's gripping journey toward justice could be a roadmap for today's fierce young leaders, and we need a roadmap. So thank you, Kit, for summarizing this important book. So Sophia, I want to just say, to start, to say that you open the book with a powerful description of what it was like to be a Black girl born in the 1950s in Elmore County in Alabama in an unjust, white supremacist world structured with those who were deemed better and those who were less. And it's such a powerful opening. So I thought we could just start at the beginning and you could tell us about what motivated you to write this book.
Thank you, Surina. I definitely respond to your question, but I too want to thank all of those folk who are on the host committee and who have joined us tonight. It's just a celebration for me. It's a warm place in my heart to recognize that something that I have written has brought together the people that are here tonight, and particularly, you know, that moving piece that Bryan Stevenson shared here with the opening. I wrote this book and had been nudged to write this book for well over 30 years. And I think that when I think about writing and my journey of writing and somehow trepidation about my words on paper, if you've known me for any length of time, you knew that was a cross that I bore in many ways. So writing this book was cathartic in many ways for me, coming from a deep shaming experience that I had about writing. In fact, the definition, a composition on utopia on my very first day in the 10th grade at Wetumpka High School in August of 1965. And I carried that shaming with me, because when I was confronted with the notion that I didn't know the definition of utopia, but I had discovered that she really was talking about what my teachers at the Black school called the theme paper, a theme paper. I didn't dare acknowledge it, but there was such a celebration when, with stark silence in that classroom, she said to me, "You don't know what a composition is, you don't know what utopia is, and you think you are fit to come to our school." And at that moment, I felt shame, wanted to just disappear, but most importantly, felt I had let down my family, my community that had invested in raising me and investing in my well-being, my teachers that were at my former school, my entire race. I had that kind of shame, and I carried that with me for many, many years. Even when I was told that I wrote well, I did not believe it because of that day. A second reason for writing this book was to capture the experiences. My sister and I were among a total of 19 students that went to the schools of Elmore County, 16 of them in the Wetumpka city. And we were not the only ones that were abused. We had another fire bombing or burning. And so, I wanted those experiences captured because I think it's so important for us to understand what's included and what's a part of people who want to push for a better life and to make things better for themselves. I also wanted to offer encouragement. As a sickly child, I somehow thought that I was the reason for my parents' poverty. I also knew that there were differences between boys and girls in terms of the kind of elevation that we got, especially in our church involvement. I wanted for people who feel and have been told that they are not good enough and somehow have arrived at the notion that I am not as worthy as others are. My journey, I hope, would provide an opportunity for individuals to examine that script and replace it with something that really speaks to the value of each of us as human beings. So I want to encourage people and hope that my writing also encourages people to write their own stories, to capture their own stories. And in this climate, as you have already spoken of, is to recognize that we are members of the human family. And therefore, it's learning more about each other that helps us to appreciate each other better and more. And I wanted people to also recognize that there were small acts of kindness that made a world of difference, even in the midst of our abuse. Small acts of kindness go a very long way. And my hope is that people will take away and look at what it's like to walk in somebody else's shoes and discover that this is what is essential for us to create the world of peace and love that I believe that is a part of what our life's mission is about.
Thank you for that. You speak of the shame that you felt, and I think it takes courage to express that. And really what I read in your book is a story of courage. And you and your sister, Deborah, made a courageous decision to integrate Wetumpka High, which you spoke about a little bit just now. And so I wanted to ask you, how did you find your courage? Was it through, some of these simple acts of kindness, or what more was there?
Well, I must say that I grew up in a community where education, it was rural, but education was lifted up as the beacon for the uplifting of the race. My mother often talked about, you got to get a good education. It's for the progress of uplifting the race and for the progress of humanity. That was her words. You got to get an education. And we would often hear our teachers saying, you got to work hard. You got to work hard. We're doing all we can do, but that's not enough. You've got to go beyond what we're giving you. And our desire was to go and attend Tuskegee Institute. That was the pinnacle of education for us in our minds. And a number of our best students, the valedictorians, salutatorians, had gone to Tuskegee and were not able to finish there. And one of those individuals, an older brother of mine, who went there for the first couple of years and then transferred over to Alabama A&M. Not to say that was somehow not as good, but what we realized is that the broken down buses and the torn books, where we had the hearts and love stories of all the white kids to each other, and some of the front was all gone, the back was off, and no real equipment in the biology lab and so forth. When we heard that there was an opportunity for us to go to Wetumpka High, we thought, wow, this is a moment for us to get a better education. So it was that was the driving force. We were a little bit naive in the sense that we heard about the civil rights movement and the bus boycott going on just 20 some miles away from us. And we heard about Dr. King, who preached in Montgomery, all of those things, but we just did not quite equate, wow, the meaning of that day, that summer day, that 7 mothers braved the sidewalk and took their children into Wetumpka High School. And so in my story, I share with you what those days were like, what the bus ride was like, what the fears were, how our parents were petrified that we may not make it home because the bus was going back to the school because there was tyranny on the bus. And bless his heart, he was so afraid that I think there was going to probably be a overpowerment of the bus and a lynching. But it was really quite a fearful time. But again, I think the courage to do that was having been instilled from early on, from learning little speeches and doing little things in the church and going to little meetings and association meetings and prayer meetings, that there was a better life. And our belief was this was our step to move us to that better life. And some naiveness about how absolutely hostile that act, would really be upon us.
Yeah, in some ways, I also think you write about being a caretaker for your siblings, and I guess I'm just thinking now that expanded. I mean, that you see, I see you as a caretaker for social justice, for gender justice, racial justice, that you have a big, expansive and generous view of what you can contribute. And so your leadership story is an important part of this book. And you write about learning to be a leader that involved also learning some unhealthy behavior. And that really spoke to me because, we're living in a pandemic where health is front and center, the importance of it, the importance of centering our own health and the health of our communities. And you write that the unhealthy behavior that you learned in terms of your leadership journey is that you didn't deserve rest or to have fun or to care for yourself because someone else always needed you. And so now that you have the benefit of hindsight, I'm wondering, what would you tell your former self? What would you tell 10-year-old Sophia?
Well, I think, Surina, part of what was connected to that issue in my mind was that I was a sickly child, and I was constantly having people give and do for me certain things. And so I was trying to give back, as well as you mentioned, the caregiving. I think the caregiving part is something that we, particularly women leaders, find ourselves in the role of being a parent, in the role of being a caregiver for other members of our family, as well as being leaders in our church, being leaders in our school, being leaders in organizations in our community. I know that I felt I could not rest because of what had been given to me. And therefore, I needed to take every moment that I had or knew to give back. Now, I understand in hindsight that takes a toll. And as a 73-year-old cousin who was my first caregiver for my son at 3 months said to me, Sophia, you work too hard. And she said, baby, if you're not kind to your body, we had a 35-year age difference, then when you get to be 73, your body will not be kind to you. You have got to take more time to rest. Well, folk, I'm 73 this year, and I certainly can identify with those words that she gave. But I would say that it's important. I think my granddaughter was about maybe 8 or 10 or something when she says, Grandma, you don't know how to have fun? And I said, I surely don't. Will you help me? And she said, I sure will. What you're going to have to do is take the day off from work. You're going to have to go to the park. We can go to the, and she named to the library. She named several activities that she thought were fun activities for her grandmother. Well, I don't want to name the activities for you, but what I will say, that self-care is one of the most important things that we can give to ourselves, because it is one of the most powerful statements that we value this temple that we have been given to house, and we value it being around for as long as it can be. Yes, in service and support, but that's an example that we need to also share, that we will love, support, but we also will do self-care for ourselves, our mental, our physical, our spiritual, being. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And others are thanking you for that in the chat, for the reminder to care for ourselves and to rest. And so I want to remind everybody that we're going to move to Q&A in just about 15 minutes or so. So be thinking about your questions. You can put them in the chat if you want, but we'll be opening it up. But before we do that, I want to continue on this thread of the evolution of your leadership, because it's such an important part of your story. And you were named executive director of FOCAL, which is the Federation of Child Care Centers of Alabama, at 23. And you came into your own as a fierce defender for the rights of your community-controlled child care centers to determine what and how children in their communities were taught. And yet you detail how, as a Black woman, you sometimes struggled in that leadership role. And I think that that's something that a lot of us can identify with as women in particular, and especially as women of color. So how did you discover your voice and identity as a leader at such a young age?
Well, one of the things that I would just acknowledge in terms of my discovering that, the leadership qualities, there were women who were part of my organization, the organization that was being formed, this 60 group of individuals that met in Tabernacle Baptist Church there in 1972. One of those women was the first Black school board member of Choctaw County, and sued the county of Choctaw because of their refusal to take for her children to get a good education there. One of the first things she said is, call me Thelma. And I said, I cannot call you Thelma because you're my mother's age. And she said, call me Thelma because I want you to understand that you are a leader here. And I don't want you to minimize your leadership and put it below in terms of, because of your age. So there were mentors. When I think about the list of people that I saw, there are several of them on this call, I hope, that were mentors to me. And that's a very important piece. Very important. Marion Wright Elderman, and Gloria Steinem, you've mentioned her, and Andrea Rabinowitz, and Maya Miller, Kit's mom, and all of those are important people to find ourselves. I had a fellowship that Jane Sapp and Hubert Sapp were both there, part of nurturing my leadership. Another piece that was key to my development as a leader was that a person who had given me advice on how to build my organization in a couple of years came and asked me if he could work for me. And this is a person I'm going, you have been a director, you've been a fundraiser, how are you going to work for me? And he said, if I work for you, I will never knowingly undercut your leadership. And knowing the principles that he operated from, because he was standing up for principles as one of the reasons that he was looking for a job, because he was terminated because of his principles. I said, I will never knowingly suppress your leadership and your creativity, because I'm afraid that you will somehow outshine me as the director of this organization. Now, what that did for me is it put me on a track of learning and growing and challenging myself and getting help and getting advice. And I was determined that I was going to lead this organization. At the same time, I was determined to keep my commitment. And at the time, we were just having the decade of women coming into be. And there were just several organizations of women that really were profound in my looking at my leadership, looking at myself, looking at the difference in my style than that of the male, and recognizing that it was important for me to value that. So I would say that journey of growth was supported by mentors. It was supported by being in fellowship with other women who were doing the same thing I was doing. And at the same time, bringing a kind of integrity and kind of principles into the work, that we weren't using labels and hierarchy to do the same thing for the people that were working in our organizations that we were fighting. And that was very important. And I think that was the spirit of what was created at the organization, focal, because it then moved itself down into the organizing strategies, the training that was offered to parents and caregivers, and it became a part of a process that was published that I'm just happy to say we used in Alabama, we used it in Australia, we used it in England, we used it in Mississippi. Those were some of the places that absolutely took the model that I think started with that early contract of my deciding that, yes, I was going to honor this contract, but I was not going to be doing it from a place of, well, what can I say? Paper, that it was going to be a real contract for me.
Yeah, you spoke of the challenges that you faced, and I want to pivot to a question that's in the chat from Chris Tilley, because they have to jump off a little early. I hope you're still here, because it's an important question about the fact that you address the issues of, other challenges, disagreements, conflicts, and just plain difficult people. And we have plenty of difficult people in our progressive movement, and it's true that we don't talk about enough, as Chris says. And so would love to hear about advice or conclusions. I mean, I think in my lifetime, 30 years or more in working for progressive causes and gender justice and racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, I've seen so many instances of what we used to call eating our own, or horizontal hostility, where we go after each other and forget about, in some cases, what we're really trying to do. And so what advice do you have, or how did you navigate that?
Well, I think that one of the important our developments that evolved out of our work, and it was just Focal as well as other organizations in partnership with us, but we recognized that we were going to be bringing different beliefs and tactics, but we felt that dealing with a community of people that had been oppressed, suppressed, and basically told that they were not fully human, 3/4 of a human being was what our vote amounted to. In order for us to help people to reach their potential, we had to challenge some of those internalized messages that had been put forth generation after generation in order for survival. So that was part of the tools that we started to work diligently in the 80s, because we saw this suppression coming in a very strong way in that decade. And how to be together was one of the first tools that we identified in terms of, and we borrowed it from transaction analysis in terms of, our giving, doing my 50%, you do your 50%, learning about each other, learning our differences, sharing our resentments, but asking permission to do that, being respectful to each other when we had a disagreement, and not hostile, but being honest about it. Those were the tools that came forth that I think is so important in our world today, because I am so deeply concerned about the messages that are being given to our young people and to each other when we are so critical, angry, hostile, divisive, and have no sense of being truthful about what it is we are projecting. So it's a tool that I hope that we will consider that starts with a vision, taking responsibility for the vision, bringing moral and ethical principles to it, and risking and nurturing each other. Those are guidelines that we incorporated in the work that we did. And it's what I've incorporated in my life, in my living today. Because I truly believe, for me, I think it was Martin Luther King that said, hate is too heavy a bucket to carry. I just don't want to carry that kind of bucket of negativeness in my spirit. I don't want to do that, because it conflicts with my ultimate belief of what my life is what my life activities and what God has expected of me. And I've come through death, near death. Once I called it death. The nurse called it death. And what I recognize is that I only can account for my spirit. I only can account for my behavior. I only can account for my actions. I hope this book helps people discover ways that we can learn about each other, we can work together with each other, and we can share our disagreements, our conflicts with each other, and walk away not disparaging and not hating.
Thank you for that. And, not hating, I think, is a form of self-care. If we carry that hate, it will eat us up. And so that pivots me nicely into my next question, which is really about, you spoke of nurturing, and one of the most beautiful chapters in your memoir, I think, is the chapter, The Power of Love, where you speak about your beautiful relationship with Marty McGower, and Marty's here with us tonight. It's so nice to see you, Marty. Marty is a white Jewish woman, and how that friendship you described it as utopia, which you spoke of earlier. And so you can explain your idea of utopia that you want to leave for the next generation, but I invite you to read an excerpt from that chapter.
Thank you, Surina. Hello, Marty. And I know that Joe Keffer, your husband, is very nearby because he always is. Sophia, how are you feeling this morning? What do you mean? I responded. Are you feeling better or worse than you were last night? My response did not satisfy Marty. She hung up and called both my sister Catherine and Alden to tell them, Sophia is not sounding right and needs to be checked on right away. It was Christmas Eve, and I had seen my doctor the day before, fearing that I had come down with influenza, which my granddaughter had caught a few days before. All my vital signs were normal, and I was told to check back if I detected fever or chills. It turned out to be a day that I have no memory of, and would end up in the hospital later that day. Marty hopped a plane and 12 hours later arrived in Montgomery, where she stayed for 13 days. I recall a teary phone call to Joe, who spent Christmas and New Year's holidays without his wife, saying how grateful I was that he supported Marty becoming my nurse for this period. He reminded me that I had done the same for her when I came to her bedside following her hip surgery.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
It speaks to this person who 1 year after my husband died, and I was on the Austin Bannerman retreat there at the Miller Ranch that you and I met earlier. And I was watching this quail family come across the yard, and no matter how quietly Marty tried to get her camera to take a photo, the parents hustled their babies to safety. And I would cry every day. And after about 15 days, I felt them, my tears had no more left. And Marty turned to me and said, it's obvious that you have a lot of stories in your head. Why don't you list them? I did, and there were 27 stories that I listed. She said, well, I tell you what, write whatever you want to about your stories, and I'm willing to read them. She later would say to me, I am only going to be a mirror for you, not a hammer. That was the beginning of this decade. And I, again, I'm grateful that, that Marty and Joe became a part of our family, because the title of this chapter came from my granddaughter, who we were going to a devotional. It was on the power of love. And I said, Tamia, tell me, what is your concept of the power of love? And she thought about it for a moment, and she said, I think it's Uncle Joe and Aunt Marty. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I think that's what I mean. That's a description of your relationship with them and them with us. And of course, I had named that chapter Utopia a couple of days earlier. And I said, perfect naming, the power of love. And I think in a way, it's a very important statement of what I hope my journey to wholeness has been about, in capturing all of the individuals, too many to name, too many mentors, too many acts of kindness, and also those who helped me to find my way. All was done in love. And I just believe love is the key. It's not going to be glossed over. It's not going to be pretty, but it comes from honesty, sharing, and a willing to hear each other, because we are all on this journey together, whether we like it or not. And I am hopeful that this story, my story, will add something to someone, and especially our next generation of people who are the ones that are going to absolutely make this world what it needs to be.
Well, thank you. That was so beautiful. I had to wipe away my own tears of joy as you were speaking about your friendship. It's such a beautiful story. So to end this part, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A from all the people who are with us tonight, is just what is a message? You know, this is such an important book, and we want to get it to as many people as we can. And so hopefully everybody saw the link that Ali posted in the chat. We're wanting to, you know, for every book that gets bought, we're donating a book to an organization. We want your ideas of who needs to read this book, especially young people, because we have to equip the next generation with the roadmap that you provide. So I want to just, my last question is what is the message you want readers to receive from reading this book, especially young people? And what is the message of hope that you want to share in the midst of the times we're living in, you know, in the midst of war, in the midst of divisions, disparities? So what do you want readers to get out of it, and what is the hope that you want to share?
Well, I certainly hope that readers will come away with a sense, particularly young readers will understand and know, regardless of the circumstance, it can be overcome. So don't give way and give up on yourself, because the world is going to miss out on a beautiful opportunity of your gifts and contribution. I also want individuals, especially parents and teachers and leaders and caregivers of all types, adults, to recognize how one word can crush the spirit of a child. How important it is to be aware that we must affirm our children, and we must provide them opportunities for growth and learning. Whether you're talking about fellowships, whether you're talking about internships, whether you're talking about citizenship encampments, which has been going on for 40 years, whether we're talking about, as the Quakers did, the American Friends Service Committee's community service youth projects, which I participated in for 3 years, we must create opportunities for our young people to experience service and experience giving of themselves. But most importantly, we must model for them the principles that we're talking about living. We can't say one thing and do another. And I think it's so important that we understand those. And if any of those can be lifted up and taken away, I thank God for this opportunity. I will say this: for the last 7 years, I struggled with a rare illness. And for days, I would sit at my kitchen table and pray and ask God to allow me to see this book finished. Please, God, allow me to be able to finish this book. And I'm very thankful. On October 2020, I said, okay, God, the book is pretty much done now. Can we extend the contract? Because I'd like to participate in sharing it with others and seeing how it's going to be received with others. So I think that I'm very grateful that even in my young years, the missionary women were coming to my mother, saying to her that they were so sorry because they thought those were my last days. And I am here to tell you that the work that we have to do, I mean, we can't put a time on it. So we just take every day, and I'm just too appreciative if there is something that has been said in this book that is a takeaway for you, just to make that light shine for you and to let you know one act of kindness one small act of kindness can go a long way in helping someone to feel good about themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, if any of you have questions, Ali has told us that we can put them in the chat, or you can do the raise your hand function. And then, you can speak your question if you have one. Here's one. What is your favorite Maria Dakku story? Thank you for being the organizer of organizers. We love you. That is from Evan Milligan.
Maria Dakku was one of our focal organizers, and she was a good organizer. She was the first person who confronted me and said, Sophia, you've got to stop hand-holding people. They are a lot stronger than you think. So, offer them, give them support, but let them do it on their own. Stop making the phone calls for them. You've got to let them make their own phone calls. You've got to let them and encourage them to come down to the State House, but you cannot handhold and have them. Now, she was the organizer and I was the directive. And I listened. And that's the beauty of Maria and other individuals who came through that organization. I grew from them just as they grew from each other and myself. And it helped me to be a better person.
Thank you for that. I just see that Stephanie Gillieu is in the chat, and she was in my cohort at the Orchard House retreat. And as always, is modeling wonderful behavior, saying that she's purchasing 3 copies of the book, one for herself, one for a young woman leader, and one who's working on childcare in Georgia, and one for the Project South Library, which Stephanie co-leads. So thank you, Stephanie. And
thanks, Steph. Thanks. And that's another grand organizer. Boy, she is an organizer of organizers.
I'll say, and I mean, I learned so much in that retreat around mutual support. And this was before the pandemic, and look at the disaster that we're in now. And so,
Absolutely.
That's what Project South has been working on, this kind of organizing that we need so much, especially now. So anybody else, would you like to raise your hand or offer another question in the chat? There's some questions that came in via the registration when people registered, and there's one that I'd like to ask, which is, when you look at the legacies of your work still standing today, not counting your children or grandchildren, what are you proudest of?
I am proud that a network of primarily women from across the state in rural communities decided they were not going to give their children away to a system that they felt did not know them or appreciate who they were. And I am so proud that those women stood their ground and pushed for policies in the state of Alabama, push for changes and practices and educational levels that I believe there is a generation of children, more than one, who experience the courage and the activism and the love that these women gave. And I believe we are benefiting from the investments that they made. I mean, these women, it didn't stop at the child care program. When the child went on to school, and if there was an issue that the mother couldn't address, the school called the provider. So it was, when I think of that, I am so proud when I think back, and I wish we could have kept better track records of all of those children. And speaking of Maria Dakku, who worked for the State Department of Human Resources for about 22 years, she said that it was a common thing in her work out in quality enhancement assessments that she was doing to hear people say, I will not let this happen. I've got some focal in me, and they are not going to do this, to our children. So it was really great to hear people take focal and make it an adjective of their defiance and of their willingness to stand up to policies that they felt were unfair and unjust.
Great, thank you so much. So I see a couple of hands raised, and so I saw Darlene Nipper's hand first, and then Phillida Burlingame also has her hand raised. So we'll close with those two. Darlene, we'll go to you. If you don't know, Darlene leads the Rockwood Leadership Institute, such an important institution in our social justice movement, and I'm happy to be an alum of Rockwood. So Darlene, to you.
Thank you, everyone. This has just been beautiful. Sophia, my question will say a lot about who I am and what I believe. So I think it's only fair to share that verse, and it's that I feel like something's been lost between the connection of the church with our movements. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are. It feels like there's been, with the data, it seems like there's less church attendance across the board, all denominations and faiths in our country, I believe. I could be wrong, someone will correct me, please. But what do you think, if anything, about this sense that I have that there's a little bit of a disconnect between faith and our movements compared to maybe when you were doing your work on the ground? Thank you.
Thank
you for this extraordinary work. I'm so moved.
Thank you. Well, I will say for sure in my growing up and in the 60s and the 70s, that the church, and especially the Black church, was fundamental in terms of the fueling ground for leaders and for coming together and for nurturing people and pushing applying those principles to the unfair systems that our country was operating from. I do think that there became a divide where people wanted to keep things the old way, from allowing for the newness to come in and allowing new leadership to come in. I mean, we were so accustomed to having leaders die out in their position as opposed to grooming new leadership. And I think that that's where some of our loss. My concern is that I believe it's the very basic spiritual principles that we get, and we can get it from a church, we can get it from a fireside, we can get it from any number of ways that we come away with some principles that are embedded in our spirit that allows for us to be courageous enough to challenge unfairness. When I decided in that classroom that day after being bullied that I knew what weapon I was going to use to come and what I was going to wear to come back that day to deal with that bully, the voice inside of me that left my body in a chill, I wasn't sure whether it was Martin Luther King or whether it was my mother or whether it was Jesus. But I knew they were all in the same field. And that said to me, and then you are no better than they are to do that. And I think fundamentally, as a human being, those kind of principles to guide my actions, to provide courage for me when I feel like I can't go another step, to walk into that room of hostility and believe that if this is the last day of my life, so be it, because I am doing what I believe is my God-given right as a human being to do. So however one gets those kind of deep-seated beliefs and principles that will drive them, hopefully, to do what is right and just for all people, even if we're challenging people when they think that they are right and they are not. I just believe that it provides some kind of guidepost for us to follow and also to pass on to the next generation and the next generation.
Thank you so much. So we're just going to wrap this part up with Phillida, who is also a longtime activist working at the ACLU Northern California, a partner of Women's Foundation California. And also there's a question in the chat. I'll just, note it in case you're able to answer that too. And then we're going to move to some closing remarks. So one question is, just before Phillida goes, is what encouragement, advice do you have for early childhood education caretakers to stay, and what can we do to bolster early childhood education, particularly now when COVID has almost decimated our early childhood workforce and enrollment by minority children? So that's just for you to contemplate. And then Phillida, would you like to ask your question or comment?
Thank you, Surina. Sophia, this has been so lovely. And I worked at Focal long ago, and the question that I have, I'm glad you mentioned the childcare advocacy in response to one of the previous questions, because that is such an important part of what you've accomplished and the work of the organization. And it's just been amazing, and sort of a policy sense, what you've been able to do for families in Alabama. Focal was the first organization that I was familiar with that really had a marriage between the internal work on ourselves and the external advocacy, and said, these are inextricable, and we're not doing the work effectively externally if we're not also focused on our internal work ourselves. And I feel like now that's kind of like, people accept that in the movement, but I feel like, back when you were saying that, it was really unusual. And I'm just wondering what you can share briefly about sort of how you came to that place, knowing that we can't do our external work in the wholeness that we need to, unless we're also kind of deeply embedded in the inward facing work, and how that manifested with the advocacy that you were doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Phillida. I'm so glad you mentioned that you were a part of Focal at one point. I have to give credit to Jack Gilbo and actually Wakesa Mazimoyo. The two of them sparred a lot on our addressing the external advocacy work versus the internal work. And what we were able to do is, through those guides that I just shared, in terms of starting with what is the vision? What is the vision that we want for ourselves? What's our vision for our children? And we started the question with ourselves, but we started with the parents. And then we asked the question, okay, so whose responsibility is it to achieve this? Is it the governor or is it the president? And we moved on down to, and what are the barriers to that vision? And often people will talk about fear, and they would talk about other things. What are the resources we need? It's a process to going and being with the people, asking them what they want for their children, what they want for their lives. And even parents would say, I just want my child to have a better life than I have. Well, if their child is having a better life than you have, what is that looking like? What does it look like if they're having a better life? So working with them to help bring clarity. We heard parents saying, I want to go back to school and learn how to read, because I know now reading is important to my child. I want to do some exercises because I am so tired when I get home, and I know being with my child and playing with my child is important. We had a number of daycare centers start to have fitness programs because parents wanted to find themselves getting in a better way. That may seem like it's far off, but I want you to understand that if a person does not see themselves connected to the vision of what they want, they're not going to write that letter, and they're not going to make that phone call. They're not going to put themselves at risk because they may lose their this or that. That is laboring work. But oh my God, it's so valuable. It's so important, because that is what ignites the spirit of people to be able to be responsible for achieving their own life goals.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So I know if you're feeling like me, we could stay in this conversation for at least another couple of hours, but we have you just until for another, under 20 minutes. And so, so to close us out of this part of the program, I know, Sophia, that you wanted to close us out with a tribute poem, and so I'd like to invite you to share that poem with us.
Thank you so much. The last 2 years, like for many folk, has been a tough year. We have lost some very, very dear people who have been a part of our lives. And I certainly wanted to acknowledge in this poem that was written by Manette Coleman, staff of the New World Foundation. And it's called, "This is my prayer of thanks." To the brothers and sisters that left us in 2020 and 2021, whose presence impacted my journey. If you get my book and read it, you'll see what they did. To Connie Curry, to John Lewis, Frida Mitchell, and Bob Moses, I'm sorry. Bob went a couple of years before, who met me on my journey and showed me the way. To Jack Gilbo, Billie Jean Young, and Robert Bracy, who held my heart as they held my hand. To Deborah Thomas, Hubert Sapp, and Alonzo Jordan, who touched me as they calmed my soul. Because of your guidance, no circle is broken here. Because of your love, I do not stand alone. This is my prayer of thanks to the brothers and sisters gone to glory. Their amazing spirits will always be here. And as long as we speak their names, they will be with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I just want to say thank you to you. I want to say thank you to all of you who are here to join us this evening, and also to those who will hopefully be looking at the recording. I really encourage you to buy Sophia's book if you haven't already, to read it and to share it with people that you think, especially the younger generation, that we need to nurture, who will lead us into the future, to share this book with them. And so thank you so much, Sophia. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Mary to close us out.
May I just make one last statement, please?
Of course.
And that's something that is found on the engraved in the National Archives building in Washington, William Shakespeare. It's from his Tempest play. What is past is prologue, meaning history sets the context for the present. I think for me, that statement says powerfully how important it is for us to capture our history, our stories, and also learn as much as we can about the history before us. It helps us to understand the present that we are operating in at this point. Thank you. Love you all.
Thank you. That's so true. Thank you for sharing that. And I'll just, before I pass it to Mary, I just want to say thank you to all of the people in the chat who are sharing that they're ordering books and where they're going to donate them. It's very encouraging. So thank you.
Thank you.
And Mary,
Thank
off to
you
you.
so much.
Thanks. And I should say there are a number of people even before tonight who stepped up offering to buy books, and we're particularly interested in making sure that that young women, especially in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, are going to be receiving the books. So some of what's been donated has already been earmarked there. And there is, as Ali put in the chat earlier, an opportunity if you have other suggestions on organizations that could be able to make good use of books. We're interested in knowing that. So we will make sure that that information gets recirculated again. I know there are a lot of other ways in which people are talking about how to spread the word. And groups that are going to be meeting. And one other thing I will mention is that, as Surina said, we're going to be posting this session on the, including Bryan Stevenson earlier tribute to Sophia on the website that it's Sophia B. Harris. .com, and we have had to make some changes in the initial focus that a lot of this would be distributed through schools, given some of the critical race theory issues that have come up that we here will in some places really make it difficult to get that in order. So with that said, there are a few thanks that I'd like to add to. One is that you're seeing now on the screen the event host committee. Every single person on that list helps with outreach and thinking about how best to pull this evening together, and we can't thank them enough. Many organizations also work to spread the word. Women's Foundation California team, anchored by Ali Diarman, and obviously with Surina's leadership, have been extraordinary, and I really want to give a shout out to them. Sophia's own support team, Mona Davis and Cynthia Brown, have been exceptional. And the Equal Justice Initiative staff, who have helped produce the tribute that Bryan Stevenson pulled together, were also extremely helpful. And so then what I want to just say in closing is to remind us that Bryan Stevenson talked about how important Sophia's story is for these times, a point that Sophia just, I think, talked about in a slightly different way. But Sophia is a woman who wanted and fought for justice, who did not want revenge. And so I'd like to just close on that note and ask us to think about how we can continue to spread the word about the book, and also to be engaged in the kind of work that Focal did and other organizations on this call are doing, that is, I think, our best hope for moving this country to a better place. Thank you all, and good evening.
Thank you again. We'll keep the Zoom open just for a few moments. If anyone wants to type anything else in the chat as we leave, we really appreciate everyone being here. And we can't wait to see your donation suggestions and see those copies of books flying off the shelves. Thank you all.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest.
Oh, how can you
We
rest?
who believe in freedom cannot rest.